The outlaw's trigger. She was hanging upside down from an old ghost gum branch, and whoever tied that rope hadn't meant for her to die fast. The rope bit deep into her ankle, twisting fabric tight, making every breath feel like a punishment under the burning noon sun. Each time she tried to breathe, her body swayed, and the branch creaked like it was counting down the seconds. Dust clung to her skin like it wanted to keep her there. Dried blood cut dark lines through it. A tall mountain man stepped out from the scrub and stopped. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He didn't look shocked. He just looked at her the way a man studies a problem that could kill him. She saw the knife in his hand. She saw the revolver low on his hip. Her voice came out thin and broken. It hurt so bad. He stepped closer. Close enough to see the swelling in her ankle. Close enough to smell fear and gunpowder in the air. "Easy," he said. But he didn't cut her down. For one long second, it looked like he might do something worse. He placed one rough hand against her side to steady her swinging body. The knife rose. The sun flashed on the steel. And still, he didn't cut. Instead, his eyes moved past her. Something about the knot wasn't right. It wasn't a station knot. It wasn't a farmer's work. A thin secondary line ran from the main rope down into the brush behind her. Hard to see unless you'd spent years tracking traps instead of dingoes. Whoever rigged it knew knots and triggers. Not a drunk shearer's work. The branch creaked again. Somewhere in the brush, metal shifted. A small click, faint but real. If he cut the main rope, her weight would change. If her weight changed, that thin line would pull. If it pulled, whatever sat in that brush would fire. He lowered the knife, drew his Webley instead. She stared at him in horror. Maybe she thought he'd lost his mind. He took one step sideways, aimed not at her, but at the brush. One breath, one shot. The crack split the ridge. An instant later, a hidden shotgun exploded from the scrub, blasting through the space where he had been standing seconds before. Wood splintered from the gum trunk. Smoke rolled through the hot air. She screamed. He moved fast now, cut the secondary line clean, then sliced the main rope. She dropped only inches before he caught her around the waist and lowered her gently to the ground. Up close, he could see the marks on her wrists. Not rope burns, hand marks. Old bruises under new ones. She flinched when he touched her, expecting pain. Instead, he shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around her without a word. "You alone?" when he asked. She shook her head. "They're close," as if to prove it. A dog barked far down the ridge, not wild, trained. Kaelen Vance had been checking trap lines that morning, nothing more. He'd come up the ridge for quiet, same as he had for years. He was 49, broad as a barn door, beard thick with gray. He'd served once as a scout when the light horse needed eyes that could see trouble before it arrived. Since then, he'd kept to himself. He'd buried more friends than he cared to count after the war. Years alone had taught him patience, but not indifference. But this wasn't trouble wandering in by chance. This was a message. Men didn't build traps like that unless they expected someone brave enough to cut a rope. Men who built traps like that didn't leave witnesses. "Who did this?" he asked. Her lips trembled. Baron Sterling. The name carried weight even up on the ridge. Sterling owned half the valley. Mayor by vote, landlord by contract, judge by influence. He had married her 3 months ago to settle her father's debt. That was a story told in town. But she said marriage like it meant prison. "I tried to leave," she whispered. He said, "No one walks away." Another bark echoed. Closer now, Kaelen looked toward the valley below. If Sterling had set that trap, then this wasn't just punishment. It was bait. Anyone who touched her became part of the lesson. He helped her sit up. Her ankle was swollen, but not broken. Painful, manageable. "It hurts so bad," she said again, softer this time. "I know," he answered. "But you're breathing." He scanned the tree line. Dust rose in the distance. Riders moving slow, confident. They weren't searching. They were coming back to collect. Kaelen stood there with a choice heavy as iron. If he walked away, Sterling would take her back and make an example out of her. If he stayed, Sterling would mark him. Men like Baron Sterling didn't forgive interference. Another dog barked, this time much closer. Kaelen slid his revolver back into its holster and rose in one smooth motion. He lifted her carefully and carried her to his horse. She winced but didn't cry out. "You don't have to do this," she said. He looked at the rope still hanging from the branch, at the splintered bark where the shotgun blast had struck. "Nobody deserves a rope like that," he replied. He mounted behind her to keep her steady and turned the horse uphill, away from the obvious trail, before this story rides further into blood and dust. Hear this plainly. What you are listening to is drawn from old frontier accounts and retold with careful shaping to bring out its lesson, its weight, and its human truth. A few details have been arranged for clarity and meaning, and the images that accompany it are crafted to deepen the feeling of the tale. If this kind of story isn't for you tonight, that's all right. Step away, rest easy, and take care of your health. But if you stay and something in it speaks to you, leave a word below so the next fire lit on this channel is one you asked for. Now keep your eyes on that ridge behind them. Riders emerged through the lower trees. One of them dismounted and stared at the blasted gum, even from a distance. Kaelen could feel the anger rolling off them. Sterling would hear about this before sundown. And when Baron Sterling learned that a mountain man had stepped between him and what he believed he owned, the valley would not stay quiet. As the horse climbed toward higher ground, one question pressed harder than the rope had pressed into her ankle. When a man who has spent years avoiding other people's wars finally chooses a side, how far will he go to finish what he just started? Kaelen didn't take the main trail. Men like Baron Sterling would expect that. Instead, he turned the horse uphill toward broken rock and thin pine where hooves left less story behind. Adeline Ross leaned back against him, shaking from pain and shock, but she didn't complain. Every now and then, her breath caught, and he could feel it through his coat wrapped around her shoulders below them. Another dog barked closer than before. Sterling hadn't sent fools. He'd sent men who knew how to follow blood and fear. Kaelen kept his voice steady. "Can you sit straight?" "I can," she said. Though her voice said otherwise, he adjusted his grip, one hand on the reins, one bracing her gently. He wasn't a man used to holding anyone, but he held her like something fragile that had already been dropped too many times. They rode for nearly an hour without speaking. The ridge narrowed. Wind picked up. The valley began to fall away behind them. Finally, they reached an old line shack tucked against stone, half hidden by cedar. It had once belonged to a trapper long gone. Now it was little more than 4 walls, a stove, and quiet. Kaelen dismounted first and lifted her down slowly. Her boot touched the ground and she winced hard enough to bite her lip. "It's bad," he asked. "It's not still mine," she answered. That surprised him. There was grit under the fear. Inside the shack, the air smelled of ash and old wood. He set her down near the stove and poured water into a tin cup. No speeches, no promises. Just small work done steady. He knelt to examine her ankle. Swollen purple rope burned raw against skin. "This will hurt," he said. She gave him a tired look. "I know what hurt is." He cleaned it with warm water and a splash of whiskey from a small bottle he kept for winter nights. She sucked in air through her teeth but didn't cry out. Outside, the wind shifted. He paused, listened. "Nothing yet." "You said Sterling married you," Kaelen said quietly. She nodded. "My father owed him for land. Drought came, livestock died. Sterling offered to clear the debt, and the price was you." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Kaelen wrapped her ankle with clean cloth torn from an old shirt. His hands were rough but careful. "He ever do that before?" he asked. "Yes." The word came flat. He sat back on his heels. He'd heard stories about Sterling. Most towns had a man like that. One who smiled in church and squeezed throats in private. "What happens if he finds us?" she asked. Kaelen leaned against the wall and looked toward the door. "If he finds us," he said, "he won't talk first." Silence settled between them. Not awkward, just heavy. Then she said something that shifted the air. "He doesn't just want me back." Kaelen glanced at her. "He wants anyone who helped me to suffer slow." That made sense. Men who ruled by fear couldn't afford kindness in public. Kaelen stood and moved to the small window. From up here he could see part of the lower ridge. No riders yet, but Sterling wouldn't give up after one trap failed. "He'll put out word." Kaelen said, "Call you unstable?" "Call me a kidnapper." "He already does," she answered. That didn't surprise him either. He turned back toward her. "You got anyone in town who'd stand up for you?" She shook her head. That answer weighed more than the others. Outside, faint and distant, a hound barked again. Not guessing, tracking. Kaelen moved fast now. He opened a small wooden chest under the bunk. Inside were cartridges, dried meat, and a folded map. He wasn't planning to run forever. Running only worked until the other man had more horses. "You ever see Sterling afraid?" he asked. She thought for a moment. "No." Kaelen nodded slowly. "Then maybe it's time someone changed that." She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. Not as a rescuer, not as a stranger, but as a man choosing something. "You don't owe me," she said. He gave a small shrug. "Maybe not." Another bark. Closer now. He stepped outside, scanning the slope. Still nothing visible. but the dogs were cutting distance. He went back in and handed her a piece of dried meat. "Eat." "I'm not hungry." "Doesn't matter." She took it anyway. Kaelen saddled the horse again and packed light. They couldn't stay, but they couldn't just keep climbing either. He made a decision then. Not a loud one. Just quiet and solid. They wouldn't run from Sterling. They would make him move. "You trust me?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded once. "Good," he said, "because we're not hidden deeper into the mountains." Her brow furrowed. "Where then?" He looked toward the valley down. Her face tightened with fear. "That's his land." Kaelen checked the revolver at his hip. "Not all of it." Another bark echoed sharp and close enough now that the horse shifted uneasy. Time had run out. He helped her mount again, careful with the ankle, and swung up behind her. As they started down the narrow path toward the edge of Sterling's territory, Kaelen felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not fear, purpose. And when a man who's been alone too long finds purpose again, that can be more dangerous than any shotgun hidden in brush. Before we ride further into this valley, if stories like this speak to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next fire lit on this trail. Pour yourself a cup of coffee or tea, settle in, and tell me in the comments what time it is where you're listening from. I always like to know who's riding along and from where. And when Baron Sterling realizes Kaelen didn't run deeper into the mountains but turned back toward town, Sterling won't ask questions. He'll send an answer. The horse picked its way down the rocky path, and Kaelen kept his eyes moving, never staring too long at any one place. He wasn't looking for beauty. He was looking for men. Adeline sat in front of him, wrapped in his coat, holding the saddle horn like it was the last solid thing in the world. Her ankle throbbed with every step, but she stayed quiet. That kind of quiet didn't come from peace. It came from learning that noise gets punished. The hounds were behind them, but Kaelen had bought time. He'd crossed a shallow creek twice, and he'd led the horse over dry stone where scent didn't cling as long. Still, he knew dogs didn't quit, and Sterling's men didn't stop paying them. As the trees thinned, the first sign of the valley showed itself. Fence posts, a dust road, and a distant line of buildings, small and low, sitting under the sky like a dare. Adeline's breathing changed when she saw it. "That's where he owns people," she said. Kaelen kept his voice calm. "He doesn't own people. He just talks like he does." She gave a short, bitter laugh, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. In town, his talk is law. Kaelen didn't argue. He'd seen towns like this, where a man with land and papers could bend the truth until it snapped. He'd also seen what happened when the wrong outsider tried to straighten it. They didn't just lose a fight, they lost their name. They reached a bend in the road and Kaelen pulled the horse into the trees. He waited, listening. A wagon rolled by, slow and creaking, driven by an older station hand with a sunburned neck. Behind the wagon, two boys rode on a mule, watching the woods like they expected a dingo. When the wagon passed, Kaelen rode out again, staying off the center of the road. He didn't want dust on his trail, and he didn't want anyone to remember his face too clearly. A mile later, the first rider appeared. Not Sterling's man, just a local trotting easy on a paint horse. The rider saw them, then slowed and stared at Adeline in the coat. His hand drifted toward his rifle. Kaelen gave him a look that said, "Keep moving." The rider didn't. He tipped his hat, half polite, half suspicious. "You folks headed into town?" the rider asked. Kaelen nodded once, just passing through. The rider's eyes narrowed as he leaned a little closer. "You got a name?" Kaelen could have lied, and he probably should have, but lying to locals sometimes planted a bigger seed than the truth. So he gave the smallest truth. "Kaelen," he said. The rider blinked, then smiled like he just found a coin in the dirt. "Well now," the rider said. "That's a name folks are talking about." Adeline stiffened. Kaelen didn't move. "What are they saying?" The rider shrugged, enjoying himself, saying a mountain man snatched the mayor's young wife and dragged her up into the hills, saying, "She's confused and you're dangerous," saying Baron Sterling's paying good money to bring her home. Kaelen felt Adeline's shoulders shake, not from cold, but from anger. She didn't speak, and that restraint told Kaelen she was smarter than fear. Kaelen kept his tone even. "People will say anything for a free drink." The rider laughed, and it wasn't friendly. "Sterling's offering more than a drink." Kaelen watched the man's eyes. The rider wasn't fine the same way as me. He was curious. Curious men were the kind who ran to tell stories, and stories turned into mobs. Kaelen leaned forward slightly, and his voice dropped. "You ride back to town, and you tell Sterling this." "You didn't see me." The rider's smile faltered. He saw something in Kaelen's face that didn't belong to town talk. He swallowed, nodded too fast, and kicked his horse into a trot back down the road. Adeline let out a slow breath. "They're hunting you already," she said. Kaelen nodded. "That's the plan," he said. "If they're hunting me, they're not thinking about what else I might be doing." They reached the edge of town as the afternoon light started to soften. A few men sat outside the hotel chewing tobacco, pretending not to stare. A woman with a basket paused at the boardwalk, and her eyes flicked to Adeline's ankle, then away. Nobody asked if she was all right. In a place like this, questions could be dangerous. Kaelen guided the horse past the hotel and toward the livery. He needed a moment to think, and he needed eyes on the street. If Sterling's men were close, they'd show themselves soon. On the corner, a fresh notice flapped on a post. Kaelen saw the bold letters before he saw the details. Reward. Bring back the runaway wife. Bring in the kidnapper. Adeline saw it too, and her face drained. "They made me a thing," she whispered. "A lost thing." Kaelen didn't let her stare too long. He turned her face gently toward him, keeping his voice low. "Listen to me," he said. "You're not lost. You're right here." A man stepped out of the law office across the street, and Kaelen's spine tightened. The man wore a badge, but not the town kind. This badge was plain, and it didn't shine like a showpiece. The man had dust on his boots, and his coat looked slept in. He didn't swagger. He watched. Kaelen recognized the type even before he saw the small letters on the badge. Deputy Commissioner. Kaelen had hoped there'd be one in a rail town like this, because the rail always brought higher eyes sooner or later. But hope didn't mean safety. A commissioner could help, or he could hand them right back if Sterling had the right leverage. The deputy commissioner looked at the reward notice, then at Kaelen, then at Adeline. His gaze settled on her swollen ankle and on the rope marks that couldn't be explained by a love story gone wrong. His expression didn't soften, but it sharpened. Adeline leaned back against Kaelen. Barely breathing, Kaelen touched the brim of his hat, a small gesture that meant nothing and everything. The deputy commissioner didn't return it. He took one slow step off the boardwalk and headed straight across the street toward them, and Kaelen realized too late that Sterling's men weren't the first danger to arrive, because the deputy commissioner wasn't reaching for his notebook. He was reaching for his cuffs there. So here's the question that changes everything. Was that badge coming to save Adeline, or was it coming to deliver them both to Baron Sterling? The deputy commissioner stepped off the boardwalk, slow, boots steady on the dirt, eyes never leaving Kaelen. One hand hovered near the cuffs at his belt, the other rested close to his revolver, not gripping it, but ready. The town went quiet in that way small towns do when trouble decides to show itself. Men outside the hotel stopped chewing. A screen door somewhere creaked shut. Adeline's fingers tightened around the saddle horn. Kaelen could feel the tremble in her shoulders. "Easy," he murmured under his breath, not taking his eyes off the badge. The deputy stopped 3 steps away. Up close, he looked older than Kaelen first guessed. Lines around the eyes, sunburned skin. A man who'd slept in more saddles than beds. "You, Kaelen?" the commissioner asked. Kaelen nodded once. "You know there's a notice up? I saw it." The commissioner's eyes moved to Adeline. They paused on the rope burn at her ankle, then on the fading bruises at her wrist. "You the runaway wife?" he asked her. She swallowed. "My name's Adeline Ross." The commissioner didn't correct her. Didn't call her Sterling. That was something. "You come with me," he said. The words hung heavy. Kaelen didn't reach for his gun. Not yet. Drawing first in the middle of town would turn every window into a rifle slot. "On what charge?" Kaelen asked calmly. The commissioner's jaw shifted, disturbing the peace. "Possible abduction. We'll sort the rest from across the street." A rider appeared at the far end of town. Kaelen didn't have to look twice to know whose colors he rode under. Sterling's men had a way of sitting taller like they owned the air. The commissioner saw them too. Something flickered across face. Not fear, annoyance. "You got about 30 seconds before this gets loud," the commissioner said quietly. That wasn't the voice of a man eager to help Sterling. That was the voice of a man who didn't like being watched. Kaelen leaned slightly closer, keeping his tone low enough that only the commissioner could hear. She was hanging from a tree with a shotgun tied to the rope. The commissioner's eyes sharpened. "Say that again." "Shotgun trap," Kaelen said. "Set to kill whoever cut her down." Adeline spoke up, her voice shaken but steady enough. "He did it. Baron Sterling." The rider across town urged his horse faster. Another figure stepped out of the hotel and pointed in their direction. The commissioner exhaled slowly. "You got proof?" he asked. Kaelen held his gaze. "Not yet." The commissioner looked at Adeline again, then at the approaching rider, then back at Kaelen. "If I cuff you," he said, "I can get you inside before Sterling's boys decide to be heroes." And then, Kaelen asked. Then we talk without half the town listening. It was a gamble, but everything had been a gamble since that gum tree. Kaelen gave a small nod. The commissioner stepped forward and snapped one cuff around Kaelen's wrist. He didn't pull hard, didn't shove, just enough to look official. Adeline's breath quickened. Kaelen met her eyes. "Stay close," he said quietly. They crossed the street together. By the time they reached the office door, Sterling's rider had arrived at the edge of the square. He called out loud enough for all to hear. "That man's wanted by order of Mayor Sterling." The commissioner didn't turn. He opened the office door and guided Kaelen inside. The door shut behind them, cutting off the noise. Inside it was dim and cooler. A desk, 2 chairs, a narrow cell in the back. The commissioner removed the cuff. "Start talking," he said. Kaelen didn't waste words. He told him about the rope, about the secondary line, about the hidden shotgun. Adeline added what she could about the bruises, the threats, the marriage that wasn't a marriage. The commissioner listened without interrupting. He didn't nod in sympathy. He didn't promise justice. He just listened. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair. "You understand something?" he said finally. "Sterling owns most of this town, but he doesn't own territorial land dispute. And then he doesn't own me." That was the first clean air Kaelen had breathed all day. But the commissioner continued. "Accusations aren't enough. I need something that sticks." Kaelen thought of the trap, of the precision in that setup. Men who built devices like that often reused parts, often bragged to the wrong people. "He's careful," Adeline said softly. "He keeps papers, records, debt notes. He thinks paper makes him untouchable." The commissioner's eyes narrowed. "Where?" "In his office," she said. "Upstairs in his house." Outside. Boots hit the boardwalk hard. Voices raised. Sterling himself had arrived. You could feel it in the air. The way noise changed when the loudest man in the room stepped in. The commissioner stood. "You two stay here," he said. "If this turns into a shouting match, I need him angry, not suspicious." He stepped outside and closed the door behind him. Through the thin wall, Kaelen could hear Sterling's voice. Smooth at first, then sharper. Something about order. Something about law. Adeline's hands twisted in her lap. "He'll lie," she whispered. Kaelen nodded. "He probably will." From outside came the sound of a fist striking wood, then a pause. Then, Sterling again, louder. Kaelen moved to the small window and looked through the slats. Sterling stood in the street, hat perfect, coat clean, smiling like a man insulted by rumor. But his eyes were hard, and they were scanning for her. Kaelen stepped back from the window. If Sterling suspected she was inside, he wouldn't shout. He'd plan. Footsteps approached the door again. The latch turned. Adeline held her breath. The door opened, but it wasn't the commissioner who stepped back in. It was Baron Sterling himself, and he was smiling. So here's the question now. If Sterling walked into that office calm instead of furious, what did he already think he had in his pocket that Kaelen and Adeline didn't? Baron Sterling stepped into the office like he owned the air inside it. 2 of his men stayed at the door, hands resting light on their gun grips, like they were part of the furniture. Hat brushed clean, boots polished, smile measured. He closed the door behind him without turning his back on Kaelen. "Well now," Sterling said gently, as if greeting neighbors at church. "I was told my wife had been found." Adeline went still, not trembling this time. Still. The deputy commissioner remained near the desk, not sitting, not relaxed. "She says her name is Adeline Ross," the commissioner replied evenly. Sterling's smile widened just a fraction. "Of course she does," he said. "She's confused when she's upset." Kaelen felt the heat rise in his chest, but he kept it down. Anger was Sterling's ground. Calm was his own. Sterling turned his eyes on Kaelen. "And you must be the mountain man," he said softly. "The one who thought it wise to interfere in a lawful marriage." Kaelen didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch. "She was hanging from a tree," he said at last. Sterling tilted his head. "Is that so?" "With a shotgun wired to the rope," Kaelen continued. Sterling gave a short breath that might have been a laugh. "You expect anyone to believe I'd stage a circus trick in my own county?" The commissioner watched both men carefully. "Adeline," Sterling said, shifting his tone almost kind. "You frightened yourself. You ran. You hurt your ankle. Now you're embarrassed." She stood slowly, leaning on the desk for support. "I was tied upside down," she said. "You told them to leave me there until I begged." Sterling's eyes flickered just once. Then he smiled again. "Commissioner," Sterling said, turning slightly. "You see what I live with?" The commissioner didn't respond. Outside, more boots gathered on the boardwalk. Word had spread. Sterling stepped closer to Adeline. stopping just short of touching her. "You belong at home," he said quietly. "Not here making stories." Kaelen shifted his weight. Not enough to draw attention, just enough to make clear that space around her wasn't empty. Sterling's gaze moved to him again. "You understand something?" Sterling said, his voice dropping lower. "This valley works because men respect boundaries." Kaelen met his eyes. "Respect is earned," Kaelen replied. Sterling's smile faded just a little. The commissioner cleared his throat. "Mayor Sterling," he said. "I've heard enough for now." Sterling turned slowly. "Have you? You'll step outside," the commissioner continued. "I need to ask you about a few matters privately for the first time." Sterling hesitated. Not long, but long enough. He glanced toward the window, toward the street, toward the men waiting. "Of course," Sterling said lightly. "I have nothing to hide." He walked toward the door, then paused with his hand on the latch. "Oh," he added casually, "I brought something that might clear this up." He opened the door and signaled. A rider stepped forward with a folded paper. Sterling didn't enter deeper. He held it out, and the commissioner took it from his hand. He unfolded the document slowly and laid it flat on the desk. Marriage certificate signed, stamped. Adeline's breath caught. "That was signed under threat," she said. Sterling shrugged. Her father was present. The commissioner studied the paper carefully. "Seal intact, names written clean. It's legal," Sterling said. "And as her husband, I have every right to bring her home." Kaelen watched the commissioner's face. The law was a heavy thing, and paper weighed more than bruises in rooms like this. "You've got witnesses?" the commissioner asked Sterling. "Half the town," Sterling replied smoothly. The room tightened. Kaelen felt the trap closing again. Only this one had no wires to shoot. Adeline's voice came out thin but steady. "He keeps other papers," she said suddenly. "Debt records, land transfers, names that don't match what's filed at the rail office." Sterling's head turned sharply toward her. "That's enough," he snapped, the smooth tone cracking for the first time. There it was, the first true sound of anger. The commissioner noticed. "What other papers?" he asked quietly. Sterling stepped forward fast. "She's lying," but it wasn't loud. It was urgent. Kaelen stepped between Sterling and Adeline without thinking. Sterling stopped inches away, eyes cold now. "You're making a mistake," Sterling said softly to Kaelen. "Bigger than you understand." Kaelen didn't blink. "I've made worse," he said. The commissioner folded the marriage certificate carefully. "Mayor," he said, "you'll remain in town until I've reviewed all your filings." Sterling laughed once, sharp. "You think you can hold me here?" "I think," the commissioner answered calmly, "that if there are irregularities in your land claims, federal authority outranks county charm outside." Voices rose louder. Sterling's men were growing restless. Sterling studied the commissioner, calculating. Then something shifted in his expression. Not fear, not anger. Confidence. He stepped back and adjusted his coat. "Review whatever you like," he said. "My records are clean." He walked to the door again, then paused. "You'll find," he added quietly, "that certain documents were moved this morning for safekeeping." Adeline's face drained of color. Kaelen saw it immediately. Moved. Sterling opened the door and stepped back into the sunlight, his men parting around him. The commissioner looked at Adeline. "What did he move?" Her voice barely carried. "The debt books," she whispered. "And the land transfers." Kaelen felt the shift in the ground beneath them. If Sterling had moved those papers before walking into this office, it meant one thing. He had expected this. And if he expected this, then he had already planned the next step. The commissioner looked toward the window, jaw tight. "We need those records," he said. Kaelen nodded slowly. The problem wasn't finding them. The problem was that Sterling would never keep them somewhere simple. And if Sterling had moved the papers this morning, there was only one place in town secure enough and dangerous enough to hide something like that. The rail depot safe, which meant if they wanted proof before Sterling twisted the law back into his hand, they would have to break into the one place in town watched closer than any house, and the next train rolled in at sundown. The deputy commissioner didn't waste time because sundown wasn't far. He stepped to the window and watched Sterling's men spread out like ants. They weren't hiding anymore. They were claiming the street. Kaelen could feel the town turning, because fear always found the widest road. "The depot's safe," the commissioner said, his voice low and sharp. "That's a risky guess," Kaelen replied. Calm but direct. "It's the only guess that fits," the commissioner answered. And he didn't blink. Adeline sat on the edge of the chair, her ankle wrapped tight, her hands folded hard in her lap. She looked smaller in that room, but her eyes didn't look small anymore. If he moved the books, she said he moved them where no one questions him in this town. Kaelen said people question him less than they breathe. The commissioner reached for his coat and checked the cylinder on his revolver. I can't order a search, he said, not on a guess. Kaelen nodded once because he understood the rules. Sterling lived on paper, and paper was a weapon. So we look without searching, Kaelen said. The commissioner looked at him like he was weighing a man on a scale. You mean theft, the commissioner replied, and his tone wasn't soft. I mean survival, Kaelen answered, and he kept his voice steady. Adeline spoke again, quiet but clear. There's a back door, she said. Behind the freight shed. Who told you that? The commissioner asked, and his eyes stayed on her. I carried boxes there, she replied. When Sterling wanted to remind me I was useful, that line hit hard and the room went still for a beat. Then Kaelen moved, because stillness was how traps got set. We need timing, Kaelen said. And he nodded toward the street. Sterling's men watch the depot, the commissioner replied. They watch everything now, not everything, Kaelen said. And he glanced at Adeline. Adeline took a breath and pushed herself up to stand. I can walk, she said. And her voice held firm. Kaelen frowned because he knew pain could make people brave and foolish. The commissioner spoke first, and he spoke plain. You walk because you know the depot layout, he said. You stay close because Sterling will look for you first outside. Sterling's voice drifted from somewhere near the hotel. He wasn't shouting now. He was talking smooth. That was worse than shouting, because smooth men planned ahead. Kaelen moved to the door and paused with his hand on the knob. If we go out together, he said, we look like a parade. The commissioner nodded and made it simple. I go out first, he said. I draw their eyes. You follow 2 minutes later, he continued. You keep to the boards and you don't run. Adeline swallowed and looked at Kaelen like she wanted permission. Kaelen gave her a small nod because she didn't need permission. She needed a chance, and that was different. The commissioner stepped outside and the door shut behind them. Kaelen listened and heard Sterling greet him like an old friend. That polite tone, it made Kaelen want to spit. Kaelen waited, counting slow in his head, because rushing was how men died. Then he opened the door and stepped out with Adeline at his side. Every eye on the boardwalk turned. Kaelen felt it like heat on his neck. Adeline kept her chin up and stared straight ahead. A man outside the hotel muttered something, and another man laughed. Kaelen didn't look at him because looking invited a fight. They moved down the street, steady and ordinary like they belonged. Kaelen kept his right hand loose near his holster, and his left hand close to Adeline's elbow. He wasn't gripping her. He was ready to catch her if she fell. At the corner, a boy with a stack of papers stared at Adeline. His eyes went wide and he took a step back. Kaelen saw the fear in that boy, and he hated Sterling for it. They passed the livery, then the store, and then the church. The depot sat beyond them near the rails, with freight stacked like small walls. A couple of men stood near the platform, pretending they were waiting for a train. Kaelen knew that kind of pretending because he had done it himself. Adeline whispered back there and nodded toward the freight shed. Kaelen guided her off the main boardwalk and into the side path behind the buildings. Smelled like hay, coal dust, and coal smoke. Behind the freight shed, the back door sat half hidden by barrels. A simple lock held it, the kind meant for honest towns. Kaelen knelt and pulled a thin piece of wire from his pocket. The commissioner had not given him that wire. Kaelen had carried it for years. Adeline watched his hands, and her eyes stayed sharp. You've done this before, she whispered. Kaelen didn't smile, but his voice softened a hair. I've opened doors, he said. When doors were built for men like Sterling. The lock clicked quiet as a secret. Kaelen eased the door open and they slipped inside. The depot office smelled of ink, sweat, and coal smoke. A desk sat near the window and ledgers lined a shelf behind it. The safe stood in its corner, tall and black, with its dial catching the light. Adeline pointed and Kaelen nodded once. They moved fast because speed mattered more than elegance. Kaelen checked the ledger shelf first because Sterling liked easy hiding spots. He flipped through titles and found freight numbers, land deliveries, and rail schedules. Nothing that looked like debt books. Nothing that looked like stolen land claims. Adeline stepped closer to the safe and placed her palm on the cold metal. He used this, she whispered. I saw him sign papers here. Kaelen looked at the dial, then at the hinges, then at the floor. He wasn't a safe cracker, and he didn't pretend to be. Outside, a boot scraped on wood, then another, then a low voice close to the wall. Adeline froze, and her breathing stopped. Kaelen moved her gently behind the desk and raised one finger for silence. The doorknob rattled once, then twice. Kaelen's hand went to his revolver, but he didn't draw. A gunshot in a depot would turn the whole town into a hornet's nest. The lock held, because Kaelen had relocked it. For a moment, the footsteps faded and Kaelen released a breath. Then came a new sound, and it was worse. A key slid into the lock, slow and confident. Sterling kept a spare depot key the way other men kept a Bible. Adeline's eyes widened, and she mouthed one word without sound. Sterling. Kaelen looked at the safe again, and understood the cruel truth. They had come for the papers. But Sterling had come for them. The key turned, the latch lifted, and the door began to open. And Kaelen had to decide whether to hide and hope or draw first and risk the town. The key turned slow. The commissioner had stayed within earshot of the depot, waiting for one wrong sound. Metal scraped metal. The depot door opened inward with the calm confidence of a man who believed the room already belonged to him. Kaelen didn't draw. Not yet. He moved instead. One step left. One hand pulled Adeline lower behind the desk. The other rested on the grip of his revolver, thumb easing back the hammer without a sound. Baron Sterling stepped inside first. He didn't rush, didn't scan wild. He closed the door behind him like he had all the time in the world. Two of his men followed, boots heavy, hands already near their guns. Sterling walked straight toward the safe. He didn't even look at the room. That told Kaelen everything. Sterling didn't think they were there. He thought he was early. You see, Sterling said lightly to his men, paper keeps the world civilized. One of the men chuckled. The other stayed quiet. Sterling knelt by the safe and began turning the dial. Slow, careful, like a man who trusted numbers more than people behind the desk. Adeline's breath shook. Kaelen leaned close and whispered one word. Wait. The dial clicked. The heavy safe door opened with a deep iron sigh. Sterling reached inside and pulled out a thick leather ledger. Another bundle of folded documents tied with string. There it is, Sterling said softly. Order. Kaelen's jaw tightened. That was the sound of a man who believed ink made him untouchable. Sterling stood and turned toward the desk to place the ledger down. And then he saw boots that weren't his own. The smallest pause, less than a second. But Kaelen saw it. Sterling's smile didn't vanish. It changed. Well now, Sterling said evenly. I thought I smelled mountain air. Kaelen stood up slowly from behind the desk, revolver still low, not raised. Adeline rose behind him. The two hired men drew halfway, not fully. Waiting for Sterling's signal, Sterling set the ledger calmly on the desk. You really should have stayed in the hills, Sterling said. Clear's throat. This town doesn't suit you. Kaelen's voice stayed level. You moved the papers. Sterling nodded once. Of course I did. Adeline stepped forward before Kaelen could stop her. You forged land deeds, she said. You threatened families. Sterling's eyes flicked to her, and for the first time there was no softness left. Careful, he said quietly. Kaelen stepped slightly in front of her again. Not dramatic, just firm. You set that trap, Kaelen said. Sterling tilted his head. You can't prove that. No, Kaelen agreed. But this might. His eyes shifted to the open safe. Sterling saw it too. The room held still outside. A train whistle blew far down the line, low and rising. The next train was coming. Sterling's jaw flexed. You think a ledger changes anything? Sterling said. You think a federal badge can outrank the men who built this place? Kaelen didn't answer that. He didn't need to. Instead, he moved faster than Sterling expected. One hard shove of the desk into Sterling's chest. The ledger slid. The safe door swung wider. One of the hired men fired. The shot shattered glass, not bone, because Kaelen had already pushed Adeline down. Gunfire in a depot was never quiet. The blast echoed like thunder trapped in wood. Outside, men shouted. The second hired man raised his rifle, but Kaelen fired first, one clean shot into the ceiling beam above him. Splinters rained down. The man ducked by instinct. Sterling lunged toward the safe, not the door. Kaelen saw it and understood. The papers mattered more to Sterling than pride. Kaelen grabbed the ledger off the desk with his free hand. Heavy. Real. Sterling slammed into him. Not graceful, not noble, just desperate. They hit the floor hard. The revolver slid from Kaelen's grip across the boards. Adeline saw it first. She moved faster than her ankle should have allowed. She snatched the revolver and pointed it straight at Sterling's chest. Her hands shook, but the barrel didn't drop. Step back, she said. Sterling froze for the first time since walking into that office. He looked uncertain. Outside, boots thundered on the platform. Voices shouted orders. The deputy commissioner's voice rose above them. Drop it, all of you. The door burst open. The commissioner stepped inside with two rail workers behind him, both holding shotguns meant for freight thieves. The hired men dropped their weapons. They weren't paid enough to die for paperwork. Sterling slowly raised his hands. Not high, just enough. Kaelen stood, breathing hard. Ledger still in his grip. The commissioner took in the scene in one glance. The open safe, the scattered papers, the gun, and Adeline's shaking hands. "You all right?" the commissioner asked her quietly. She nodded once. Didn't lower the revolver until Kaelen touched her wrist gently. Sterling straightened his coat like nothing had happened. "This is harassment," he said sharply. "I will file charges." The commissioner walked to the desk and flipped open the ledger. His eyes moved down the columns. Names, amounts, land parcels marked transferred under pressure. His jaw tightened. "These filings don't match territorial records," the commissioner said. Sterling's calm cracked. "Those are private debt, not when they affect federal rail grants," the commissioner replied evenly. That landed. Sterling understood what that meant. This wasn't just town politics anymore. This was territory. The train whistle blew again, louder now, rolling into the station. Steam hissed outside. The whole depot shook slightly with the approach. Sterling looked toward the door. Not at escape. At timing. Kaelen saw it too late. Because Sterling wasn't planning to fight, he was planning to vanish. As the train screeched into the station and steam clouded the platform, Sterling suddenly lunged toward the open door, knocking one of his own men aside. And before anyone could grab him, he disappeared into the white wall of steam and noise. The commissioner swore under his breath. Kaelen moved toward the door, ledger in hand through the steam. Shadows moved, passengers stepping down. Faces blurred past, but Sterling's clean coat didn't belong in that chaos. Workers shouting. And somewhere in that chaos, Baron Sterling was running. So here's the problem now. If Sterling reaches that train with nothing but the clothes on his back, he loses power. But if he reaches it with something hidden that none of them saw him take from that safe, what exactly did he just escape with? Steam swallowed the platform in a thick white wall, and for a second, the whole world felt blind. Kaelen pushed through it without thinking. Ledger tucked tight under one arm. Eyes burning from coal smoke, just boots moving, voices shouting, passengers stepping down from rail cars, confused and irritated. "Sterling," Kaelen muttered under his breath. The train hissed again, metal grinding against metal as it settled. If Sterling reached a car and shut a door behind him, this town would wake up tomorrow with a different story. One where he was the victim, one where Kaelen was the outlaw. Kaelen moved along the side of the train, scanning faces. Then he saw it. A coat too clean for freight work. A hat pulled low, moving fast toward the rear passenger car. "Sterling!" Kaelen changed direction and cut across the platform, ignoring the sharp pain in his shoulders from the earlier fall. "Stop him!" Someone shouted behind him. Maybe the commissioner, maybe a rail worker. Didn't matter. Sterling grabbed the rail of the last passenger car and pulled himself up the steps. The conductor shouted something about tickets, but Sterling shoved past him. Kaelen reached the steps just as the whistle blew again. The train began to move, slow at first, then stronger. He caught the rail with his left hand and hauled himself up as the wheels clanked into motion. The ledger nearly slipped from his arm, but he locked it tight inside the narrow aisle. Sterling was already pushing through startled passengers. He didn't look back. That was Sterling's way. Always forward, never face what he left behind. Kaelen moved after him, steady and deliberate. No wild rush, just closing distance. The train picked up speed. Outside, the town began to slide away. Sterling reached the rear platform between cars and stepped out into open air. Wind whipped his coat. Steam rolled past in bursts. Kaelen followed. The world outside blurred into tracks and dust. The platform between cars shook with the rhythm of iron on rail. Sterling turned then finally. "You don't know when to quit," Sterling said over the roar. Kaelen's voice came back calm. "You ran." Sterling laughed once, breath sharp. "I adapted." Kaelen shifted his stance. Boots wide for balance. "Where's the rest of it?" Sterling's eyes flickered. "Just once. There's always more," Sterling replied. That confirmed it. Sterling hadn't just moved papers. He had taken something. Something small enough to carry. Something worth running for. Sterling lunged first, not with a gun, with a shoulder. They slammed into each other hard against the iron railing. The ledger slipped from Kaelen's arm and hit the floor between them. Sterling went for it, not to read it, to throw it. Kaelen grabbed his wrist before he could toss it off the train. The wind tore at them. The ground below rushed past too fast to survive a fall clean. Sterling drove his knee upward. Kaelen twisted, taking the hit along his hip instead of his ribs. They grappled in close quarters. No room for wide swings and no room for clean punches, just weight and breath and stubbornness. Sterling's hand dipped toward his coat pocket. Kaelen saw the motion and slammed his forearm down. A small leather packet dropped to the platform between their boots. Sterling froze. Kaelen glanced down. It wasn't thick, not like the ledger, just a folded bundle tied tight. Land transfer seals, federal stamps, blank but signed, forgery waiting to happen. Sterling moved again, fast and desperate. He shoved Kaelen backward toward the edge of the platform. Kaelen's heel slipped half off the metal lip. Air rushed beneath him for a heartbeat. The valley spun below. Sterling leaned in close, voice low and cold. "You think you're helping her?" Sterling said. "You're ruining her." Kaelen didn't argue. He drove his head forward instead. Forehead met Sterling's nose with a sharp crack. Sterling staggered back, clutching his face. Blood ran quick between his fingers. Kaelen regained his footing and stepped forward, picking up the leather packet with one hand. The train began to curve along a bend in the track. The speed eased slightly, just enough to give a desperate man a chance. Behind them, the commissioner had reached the last car and was forcing his way toward the rear platform. Sterling looked at Kaelen, then at the curve ahead, then at the drop beside them. He wasn't beaten yet, not in his own mind. "You can't prove intent," Sterling spat through blood. "You can't prove the trap." Kaelen held the leather packet up between them. "Maybe not," he said, "but I can prove this." Sterling's eyes darkened. Then he did the last thing Kaelen expected. He smiled, and instead of reaching for the packet, instead of reaching for a weapon, Sterling stepped backward toward the edge of the moving train. "Careful," Sterling said softly. "Men like you don't belong in towns like mine." Then he let go. He dropped from the platform into the dust beside the tracks as the train rolled forward. Kaelen rushed to the railing and looked down. Sterling hit hard, rolled, didn't rise immediately. The train carried Kaelen past him before he could see more. The commissioner burst onto the platform seconds later, breathing hard. "Where is he?" the commissioner demanded. Kaelen looked back along the track, dust trailing behind them. "He jumped," Kaelen said. The commissioner stared at him. "Is he dead?" Kaelen watched the shrinking figure beside the rails. He couldn't tell. But one thing felt certain. Men like Baron Sterling didn't gamble on death unless they believed they still had one more card to play. And if Sterling survived that fall, he wouldn't crawl back quietly. So the real question now is this. And when they stop this train and ride back down those tracks, will they find a broken man in the dust? Or a man already planning his final move? The train slowed near the outer bend where the tracks curved back toward open range. Kaelen and the commissioner jumped down before it came to a full stop, boots hitting gravel hard. Dust still hung in the air along the rail line where Sterling had fallen. They ran back along the tracks without speaking. The wind had shifted. The steam had cleared, and the valley looked quiet again, almost innocent. They found him 50 yards back. Baron Sterling lay on his side in the dirt, coat torn, hat gone, breath shallow but steady. Alive, one arm lay at an angle that told its own story. His face bloodied, but alive. He tried to push himself up when he saw them. Stubborn even now. Kaelen stepped closer, not angry, not smiling, just done. Sterling looked at him through one swollen eye. "You think this changes anything?" Sterling rasped. Kaelen didn't answer. The commissioner stepped forward and read him his authority. Plain and simple. Forgery of federal seals, interference with rail land grants, conspiracy to defraud settlers. The words hit heavier than fists ever could. Sterling's strength faded as the truth settled in. Paper had been his weapon. Now it was his chain. They loaded him onto a freight wagon bound for the next federal holding town. Not dramatic, not loud, just final. By the time the wagon rolled away, the sun had begun to sink. Back in town, something had shifted. It wasn't cheering. It was quieter than that. Men who had once lowered their eyes when Sterling passed now stood straighter. A woman outside the store nodded at Adeline instead of looking away. The boy with the newspapers stared at Kaelen with something new in his way. Not fear, respect. Adeline stood near the depot platform, ankles still sore, coat still wrapped around her shoulders. She watched the wagon disappear down the road until it was only dust. "You didn't have to stay," she said quietly to Kaelen. He looked out across the valley. "I didn't," he agreed. That was the truth. He could have walked away at that gum tree. He could have told himself it wasn't his business. He could have stayed safe in the mountains where no one asked anything of him. But something changes in a man when he sees wrong up close and when he hears someone say it hurts so bad and realizes silence would hurt worse. Adeline turned toward him. "What happens now?" she asked. Kaelen let out a slow breath. "Now you decide," he said. That was the part Sterling never understood. Control works until someone remembers they have a choice. Over the next few days, the commissioner began reviewing every ledger. Names were cleared. Land was returned. Debts were questioned. Not everything fixed overnight. Life rarely works that clean. But the fear cracked. And once fear cracks, it never seals the same way again. Adeline chose not to leave town right away. She chose to stand in it, to say her own name out loud, to walk past doors that once felt like cages. Kaelen stayed longer than he planned, long enough to see that strength doesn't always come from muscle. Sometimes it comes from staying. Now let me step out of the dust of that valley for a moment and speak plain. I've always believed that most of us face a rope at some point in life. Maybe not tied to a tree, but tied up by fear, pride, or debt. It is easier to stay quiet. It is safer to mind your own business. But what kind of town do we build when every decent man decides it is not his fight? I have learned over the years that courage is not loud. It is not speeches and flags. It is one steady decision made when nobody promises you anything in return. Kaelen didn't rescue Adeline because he wanted praise. He did it because he could not live with himself if he did not. And that question stays with me. When was the last time you stepped towards something hard instead of away from it? When was the last time you chose integrity over comfort? Baron Sterling believed power came from fear and paper, but paper burns. Fear fades. Character stays. If this story has meant something to you, if it has reminded you of a choice you need to make, then let it settle in. Let it challenge you. Let it strengthen you. If you found value in this tale, take a second to like the video and subscribe so you do not miss the next story we ride into. Each one carries a lesson, if we are willing to hear it. And tell me this, where in your life are you being asked to stand steady? Where are you being called to act instead of watch? Because sometimes the difference between a town ruled by fear and a town built on respect is one man who says easy, looks twice, and does the unthinkable for the right season.